We are in the seventh week of this series we're going through on the book of Revelation. Revelation is the last book in the New Testament, last book in the Bible. It's this really kind of confusing book because it's written in this really weird style. And so we've just kind of been making our way through it, trying to understand what is it really all about? Because if you're anything like me, it's really not really what I was taught it was about. It's about something totally different. And so we're kind of making our way through it, trying to understand what is this book really all about? And even then, what is the significance for us today? Because Revelation is a letter. It's a letter written from this guy, John, to 7 churches located in what we would now call Turkey. But a lot of times it's just referred to as Asia Minor. And here's a map. I've shown this every week. This is a map of the 7 churches that John specifically addresses this letter to. In the beginning of the letter, he'll actually point out each one of these, and he'll say them each by name. And they all exist fairly close together. They're all kind of connected by this kind of route, and they're right in the heart of the first century Roman Empire. John writes Revelation toward the end of the first century, maybe 80 or 90, something like that. And so again, if you were to zoom out, this area is located right in the heart of the Roman Empire. And at this point, what we know is there's probably only about 7,500 Christians in the entire Roman Empire when Revelation's written. It's not a lot. The population of the empire is probably something like 50 or 60 million. So it is this very small, powerless minority that they're constantly feeling pressure. Because part of being a good Roman citizen is you worship the emperor, you worship Rome. This is how we carry favor with the gods. But Christians refuse to do that. We only worship the one true God. And so because of that, they faced persecution. Sometimes that persecution took the form of like violence, imprisonment, death. But even when it wasn't that, you would face persecution in the sense of you would be kept out of trade guilds, which means you wouldn't be able to make money. You wouldn't be able to earn a living. So these churches are up against all kinds of challenges, opposition, persecution. And Revelation is this letter that's written to encourage them. That, hey, here's how you overcome. Here's how you triumph in the midst of everything that you are facing. And Revelation makes very clear, there's opposition. You are facing opposition. And where we are now, we're in Revelation 12 and 13. And Revelation 12 and 13 is going to mention specifically who are the enemies that you are actually up against. And Revelation is actually going to identify, yes, there are enemies that you are up against. This opposition is coming from these enemies. And this is, again, I said this a couple weeks ago, but we're in this part of Revelation where it starts to get really interesting. Because what we're going to be introduced to in Revelation 12 and 13 is 3 enemies, 3 specific enemies that these churches are up against. And it's a dragon and 2 beasts. And it's intentionally 3. Like John does this on purpose. Because when John writes about God in the book of Revelation, and really when God is talked about really kind of all throughout both the Old and New Testaments, God is talked about as being this triune God. You may not be familiar with the word triune, but maybe you've heard the term trinity, that there is one God, but this one God exists eternally in 3 persons: God the Father, God the Son, and the Spirit. God the Father is like the creator of all things, who spoke the universe into existence. The Son is Jesus, whom God sent into the world, and then the Spirit is God's presence that lives among God's people. And so again, this is what's referred to as the Trinity, and John talks all about this throughout Revelation, that it's one God, but this one God exists eternally in these 3 persons. And so the dragon and the beast are presented as basically a counter to that. They are this unholy Trinity. And you're going to see they're different, but at the same time, they're all kind of connected. And so what I want to do is I want to go through and I want to look at, hey, what does John say about this dragon and these 2 beasts? And what is he saying to these churches about these dragons and these 2 beasts? So we're going to throw a whole bunch of stuff at it. And as we go through this, you may be wondering, what on earth does this have to do with us? We're going to get there at the end, so hang with me. Okay, we got to go through what it is that John's saying, and then we'll come back and say, okay, I get what it meant to them, but how does this have anything to do with us? So what's fascinating is when we first meet, the first enemy we're going to meet is the dragon, and when we're introduced to the dragon, our attention is actually not to the dragon first, it's to something else. That this dragon emerges in response to something else that happens. Revelation 12, verse 1. And here's what John says. He says, "A great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth." And so what we see is this child that's going to be born, but we're told this is a great sign. This word sign is like, it's a spectacle. This is an event. This is not just any birth. This is a significant moment. This is this big spectacle. This is different from every other birth. So this is a sign. And what happens is this sign is then followed up by another sign. So Revelation 12, verse 3, and we're going to read 3 through 5, then we're going to skip to 9. Then, so in response to the first sign, then another sign appeared in heaven. An enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. And then if you skip to verse 9, John identifies who this dragon is. He said, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan. So when we talk about the devil or Satan, this is like all throughout the Old and New Testament, throughout the entire Bible. This is the enemy of God. The actual title for Satan or the devil or whatever is the accuser, the deceiver. This is the one who's been against God really since the beginning. If you go back, the first book in the entire Bible, first book in the Old Testament is Genesis. God creates the world. He makes it all the way he wants it to be, and into that emerges the Satan. Actually, that's how you say it. It's not just Satan, it's the Satan. The Satan, the accuser. And he kind of throws the whole thing into chaos. He's the one who kind of comes in there and convinces people to disobey God and throws the whole thing. So since the beginning, absolute beginning, there has been this evil, this force, this personification of evil in the Satan, in the devil that has been against God. And what's interesting is really kind of since everything went down in Genesis, like in Genesis, again, the Satan kind of comes front and center as this snake, but then he's kind of behind the scenes. He's still working, he's still out there, he's still against God, but he's kind of behind the scenes. But now when you get to Revelation, John tells us, hey, there's this birth. Remember, this woman is going to give birth to this baby, and this birth has now drawn the Satan out. That he's now come out. He's been behind the scenes the whole time. He's been working, opposing God the whole time. But now, in response to this birth, this has drawn the Satan out. He has come out. And the reason he's come out is to devour the child. That somehow the Satan, the devil, looks at it and goes, hey, this child is bad. I need to get rid of this child. This is not good. Now, the language that's used here to talk about this dragon, the Satan, I'll probably refer to it as the dragon most of the time, but the language used to talk about the dragon actually comes from the Old Testament book of Daniel. And really today, John's going to be quoting and referencing the book of Daniel a lot. Daniel's one of the prophets in the Old Testament, and the language used to describe the dragon, it's not like a theological explanation of where the dragon comes from or the origins of the dragon. It's just meant to describe power. That there is power, that this dragon, the Satan, the devil, has power. Revelation 12, verse 5. She gave birth to a son, a male child who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. So this woman is going to give birth. The dragon shows up to devour the baby, to kill the baby as soon as it's born. But before the dragon can devour this baby, God snatches the baby up, brings him up with God into heaven, and then the mother is sent off for 1,260 days. And war breaks out into heaven. Now, the language that's used to describe this baby, the one who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, this is Old Testament messianic language. The Messiah was the one that God was going to send to make everything right. And so Jesus, when he's born, is the fulfillment of this idea of the Messiah. That's what Jesus says. I am the Messiah. This is what his followers claim. He is the Messiah. So the baby born is Jesus. And so Jesus' birth is this spectacle. It is this event. It is this sign. And in response to the birth of Jesus, the dragon comes out to try and devour this baby, but can't. And Jesus ultimately ends up ascending into heaven with God, which, if you go back to Jesus' life, right, like Jesus he's ultimately betrayed, he's crucified, he's killed, he's buried. and then he resurrects. And after his resurrection, after he comes back to life, he's on earth for about a month. And then the last really thing we have recorded for us about Jesus' life on earth is that he ascends into heaven with God, where the rest of the New Testament writers will say, and now he reigns with God. That because of his death and resurrection, he has overcome, he has triumphed, he has conquered, he is making all things new. He is now the king, and he is bringing everything back to himself. And so this is what John is getting at here. Like this is what happened. That this dragon tried to overpower Jesus, couldn't overpower Jesus. And Jesus now is the exalted king, which again, Revelation talks about all over the place. That Jesus is on the throne. Jesus is on the throne. Now the mother of the child that's being described here is not referring to Mary, Jesus' actual mom. And you know that because actually if you go back, when this pregnant woman is first described, we're told that I believe it's 12 stars is what she has above her. But the number 12 is used to describe something around it. Because remember, originally there's like this light and this brilliance. 12 is always the number of the people of God. Always. In the Old Testament, there's 12 tribes of Israel. In the New Testament, there's 12 apostles. So whenever you see 12, this is always a reference to the people of God. So the mother of whom Jesus comes out of is not like an individual, it is a people. It is God's people. Jesus comes out of the nation of Israel. He's born out of Israel, the people of God, and then when you get to Revelation, the church is now the new Israel. So Jesus comes out of the people of God. He ascends up into heaven now, and now you have the people of God that are in the desert for 1,260 days. That's significant. That is 3.5 years. Is what that is, which is a broken number 7. We talked about this a little bit last week, but 7 is the number of God. So a broken 7, half of 7, is kind of like this incompleteness. And again, going back to the book of Daniel, 3.5 years is a time of persecution. In Daniel's prophecies, like 3.5 is this is a number that represents persecution against the people of God. So what you have is Jesus being exalted, but now the church is in this time, the people of God are in this time of persecution, and war breaks out in heaven. Now, ultimately, God and his angels are victorious against the dragon. That's who this war is between, right? You have God and his angels on one side, and then you have the dragon on the other. God and his angels are victorious, but I want you to notice why they're victorious. Revelation 12:11. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. Now, Revelation uses a ton of war language, like a ton of war. It's all over the place. Even use it here. This war breaks out in heaven. But whenever Revelation uses war language, it always turns it upside down. It uses what is, again, what people would understand as war language, what people would understand as violence, but flips it. So this war breaks out in heaven. God and his side win over the dragon and his side, but notice why they win. It's not because they fight. It's the blood of the Lamb, which the Lamb is Jesus. The slain Lamb. This is an image we've talked about all throughout Revelation. They win not because of some future battle they fight, but because of what Jesus did on the cross. See, God's victory in Revelation always goes back to what Jesus did on the cross, that he gave up his life. He was crucified. It was his blood that was spilled. He died. He was buried. He conquered and overcame. Revelation isn't looking forward to some future victory where God lines up as a general and marches his soldiers and just obliterates everybody. Revelation always looks back and says the reason we have victory is because of Jesus. This is where victory comes from. We're not waiting for victory. Victory has already happened. And notice the only other thing that God's side fights with, the word of their testimony. That's it. They're not having spears, they're not having swords, they're not cutting down pagans and people who oppose God. It is their declaring that Jesus is king because of his death and resurrection. That's their testimony. So even though it uses all this war language, the only fighting that's done is Jesus on the cross and literally the witness and the testimony of God's people. So the dragon is defeated, he is overcome, he is conquered, and then he is thrown down to earth. He's hurled down to the earth, but he doesn't stop. Even though he's lost this big battle trying to overcome Jesus, he does not stop. Revelation 12:13, and then skipping to verse 17. John writes, when the dragon saw that he'd been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman, which again, the people of God, who had given birth to the male child. And you skip to verse 17. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. So again, the only thing God's people are fighting with in heaven and on earth is their testimony, is their witness, that our lives are this embodied witness to the fact that Jesus died, he rose again, and he is king. And here's the difference that makes in my life, here's the difference it makes in the world, here's the hope that we have. The only thing God's people ever fight with in Revelation. And so once the dragon loses this battle against God and against Jesus, trying to devour Jesus and stop Jesus, the dragon immediately turns its attention to the people of God. I can't win this battle. Maybe I can win this one. And this now is where the dragon is going to call in these reinforcements. This is where the dragon is going to call in these beasts. And there's these kind of long sections in Revelation that describe each one of these beasts. There's 2 different beasts. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read kind of a lengthier chunk that talks about the first beast. And I'm just going to read it. You can follow along on the screen if you want to. If you just want to listen, you can close your eyes and listen or whatever. I just want to go over because I want to read John's words. You don't have to remember all of it. I just kind of want us to see how he pictures this beast. And then we'll talk about what this beast is, and real quick we'll move on to the second one. So here's what John says. Here's the first beast. So after the dragon has lost, now is going against the people of God. Revelation 13, verse 1. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and each head a blasphemous name. The beast's eyes all resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. And they also worshiped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. So now in his war against the people of God, the dragon then summons this first beast. It's described as this beast out of the sea. And there's all this epic language used to talk about the beast. If you go back again to Daniel, Revelation uses a ton of Old Testament language, a ton of language from the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, Daniel 7, Daniel has this vision of 4 beasts, 4 specific beasts, and they come out of the sea. And if you look back at Daniel 7, these beasts are described as a winged lion, a bear with 3 tusks, a 4-headed winged leopard, and then the last beast is just described as like powerful with large teeth to crush its enemies. And in Daniel, these 4 beasts each represent a different kingdom that is opposed to the people of God, to Israel at this point. So it's these 4 kingdoms that are opposed to the people of God that to some extent persecute and oppress the people of God. Now in Daniel, ultimately all 4 of these kingdoms are overcome, and when they're overcome, what God does is God gives authority to one like a son of man. That's what happens in Daniel. These kingdoms that are opposed to the people of God, persecute the people of God, they're overcome, and God gives all authority to one like a son of man. Jesus, by the way, his favorite title for himself is Son of Man. That's what he'll call himself all the time. And Son of Man comes a lot from Daniel, also comes from the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel in the Old Testament. So what John does in Revelation here is he takes this kind of same language, he takes these 4 beasts, but he combines them into one. Instead of having 4 beasts, that represent these four kingdoms, John is basically saying, hey, the power that existed in these four beasts, it's all brought together in this one. That this is like the super beast, comprised of all these other ones. And this is the beast that stands against God. This is the beast that rules the world on behalf of the dragon, and no one can oppose it. No one can wage war against it. No one will fight, because if we do, we're going to get worked. This is the beast that defies God and opposes his people. And again, if you go back to Daniel, where the image of the beast originates from, it's kingdoms that oppress God. So the seven churches live amongst one super powerful empire that is Rome. The first beast, the way it's described, the way it's talked about, is clearly for these seven churches, it's a picture of Rome. That this is who Rome is. Rome is this one who rules over everything at the world. I mean, this is the most powerful empire the world had ever known. And they rule over everything, and they've conquered everything, and no one will fight them, no one will oppose them. All nations are under Rome. And in Rome, it talks about that how this beast is the one that like opposes God and his people and the place where God lives. Rome is the empire that had destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. About 10 to 20 years before Revelation's written, they marched into Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, which is where Jewish people believe God lived. Rome's also the one that crucified Jesus. They're the ones that gave Pilate, the Roman governor, said, hey, let's crucify Jesus. So in every way, Rome is opposed to God and the people of God. Rome is this power that covers over the entire world. Now, there's this interesting phrase in there about how one of the heads of this beast has a wound, but that wound has been healed. And people kind of try to interpret that. Scholars try to interpret that differently. If you go back to the 60s, there was an emperor by the name of Nero. And Nero was like the worst of all the emperors up to this point. Arguably the worst ever. Nero's the one who just like persecutes Christians, cuts them down left and right, burns them alive for his own amusement. Nero is evil as you can be. Now, Nero ends up killing himself, and then that sets off this like what's called the Year of the Four Emperors, where it's kind of this like civil war thing, and there's all this fighting back and forth. But out of that, there's one emperor that emerges. That's actually Domitian, who's the emperor when Revelation's written. It's his grandpa, and he kind of reestablishes Rome and resettles Rome and puts everything. So a lot of people think it refers specifically to that. Like, hey, there was this event that could have potentially been bad, but Rome recovered from it. Other people think it may just be a reference to like, hey, you can hurt Rome, but they're so powerful and they're so strong, they keep coming back. That yes, you can hurt them. Yes, you can attack them, but they keep healing. They keep coming back. They are this like powerful force that even when they face obstacles, they have the ability to overcome it. So the way that Rome, as this first beast of the sea, is described, it's very much described with some of the similar language that's used to describe the dragon. And the reason for that is because John keeps saying where this beast gets its power is from the dragon. That this beast, Rome, is acting on behalf of this dragon, the enemy of God, the accuser, the Satan. So there's a lot of similar language because they're intimately connected. The beast operates on behalf of the dragon. Rome rules the earth on behalf of the dragon, and it uses the dragon's power to do it. Now, John's going to go on. He says, now there's another beast. This one I'm not going to read as big of a section, but this is the second beast. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast. Because of the signs it was given, power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. So you have the second beast that shows up, that really the description of it is the second beast then operates all the authority on behalf of the first beast and forces people to worship the first beast, to go along with the first beast. So again, scholars debate over exactly what the second beast represents. Some people, and this is all honesty probably how I would tend to lead, some people refer to that second beast as the emperor. That because the emperor is the one person that exercises all the authority of Rome. Like, hey, I am the leader of Rome, I'm in charge, the military, all the power of Rome is on behalf of me. The emperors were the one who would force people within the empire to worship the emperor, but also to worship Rome. in the form of Roma, which was this goddess that was like the embodiment of Rome. It was part of participating in Roman civil religion. So some people think it's specifically the emperor. Some people just think it's more of like local leaders. Because again, this is a letter written to these 7 churches. And so in each of these 7 areas, you would have a local leader that exercised their authority on behalf of the emperor. So for these 7 churches, they're not dealing with the emperor all the time, but they have, some kind of governor or something like that. That this is their embodiment of evil. This is the one who's leading Rome in their life and in their mind. Some people honestly think it's just essentially the power of Roman ideology. That it's the cultural power of Rome, it's leadership, it's propaganda, it's all that stuff. It's the stuff that exists within any culture to conform you to be like that culture. So Rome is so powerful because of its influence and its wealth and its military. If you live within the Roman Empire, there is always this pressure to conform, to become like Rome. And it manifests itself in politics, propaganda, economics, all this other stuff. So it could be any one of these specific things. Again, if you're going to ask me, I would probably lean toward the emperor, but it doesn't really matter as long as you get the second beast is really kind of this embodiment to pressure people to become like the first beast. And the second beast does something super significant that a lot of people tend to focus on. Verse 16. It, the second beast, also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. So when I was a kid, I grew up in the church in the 80s and the 90s and stuff like that. And this is everyone thought the world was going to end. And, they all tied it to all these prophecies. And I remember growing up being told, they're going to try to implant this microchip in you. And if you get this microchip, this is the mark of the beast. And so everyone was always afraid, don't do this, don't do that. Some people would actually say it was a tattoo. But what we're told in Revelation is that the second beast forces people to get this mark. What does that even mean? What is John's point? What is he saying? What is he getting at? Now, marks or seals were kind of I don't want to say super common, but they weren't uncommon in the first century Roman world. All right, it was a common practice to brand, like we would brand cattle, to brand slaves or conquered soldiers. That is you branded them this is my mark. We now own you. Because we defeated you, we now own you. Religious tattooing was not that uncommon to show your devotion to a specific deity. You would get a tattoo of that deity to say hey, this is my God, this is my goddess. That same word that's used to describe Mark here in Revelation is the same word used to describe the image of an emperor on the coins. So how we put our presidents and stuff on our coins? They would put their emperors, and that's the emperor's mark. That is their mark. It's theirs. It's ultimately their money. It's the same word. That word mark is used to describe, if you've ever seen old movies where they have a wax seal, and then they'll seal a letter with the wax seal of the king or the governor or the queen or whoever it is. That's that same word. That is a mark. There were also actually in Rome certificates that were issued when you had completed your duty to worship the emperor. It was proof. Have you worshiped the emperor? Because worshiping the emperor was part of participating in Roman civil life. And when you worship the emperor, you got the certificate that said, hey, you're a good citizen. You worship the emperor. So here is your mark. Here is your seal that you have actually worshiped the emperor and you've fulfilled your duty. So the idea of marks and seals is pretty common in the first century world. It's not an idea that's way out there. And even this word, receive a mark, that word mark is a pretty common word. Now, we looked at this if you were here last week or if you watched last week, but earlier in Revelation, we're told that God seals his people so that they can be saved. And again, it's not a specific mark or anything. Really, in the New Testament talks about how the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, is our seal. That when we place our lives into Jesus, when we follow Jesus, God's Spirit, his presence comes to live with us, and that's our seal. That we belong to God. We are part of the people of God, and we are part of God's saving work in the world. So this whole thing about this mark of the beast is really, at its core, it's meant to be a counter to God's people who've already been sealed. That you have God's people who have been sealed because they're going to be saved, but now here you have these people that are loyal to Rome, they're loyal to the Roman Empire, and so their seal is what's saving them from Roman violence and Roman authority and Roman persecution. So this whole idea of the mark of the beast it's not something you're going to be tricked into. All right, Elon Musk is not going to try to trick you into getting a microchip and insert it in your brain, and all of a sudden you're going to feel like, oh, now I belong to Satan. That's not the point of it at all. I'm not saying you should get a microchip in your brain. I'm just saying the way Revelation talks about it, it's not something you're going to be tricked into. It is an intentional choice about allegiance. Who are you allegiant to? Is your allegiance to God and to the Lamb? Or is it to Rome and the dragons and the beast? And if your allegiance is to Rome and the dragons and the beast, yes, you may be saved from Roman violence and Roman persecution and this, but you're not necessarily going to be saved from the coming downfall of Rome. If you are sealed as the people of God, yes, you may suffer at the hands of Rome. You may suffer persecution and oppression and marginalization, but in the end, you will be victorious and you will overcome. So don't be looking for the mark of the beast in this or in that. It's about allegiance. It's a conscious choice that we make. Who are we choosing? What are we choosing to live allegiant to? And then you get this like famous verse that everyone kind of focuses on, Revelation 13:18. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, this is what the mark's gonna be, for it is the number of a man, that number is 666. And this is one that people like focus on, like who is 666? Who is this person? What is this all about? And again, John's saying is, hey, this calls for wisdom. And again, he's tying this is all tied back to dragon power that's manifested in Rome and in the leadership of Rome and in the ideology of Rome and in the political powers of Rome. And so he identifies as, hey, this is personified in a person. Again, you will have, if you were to research this, different biblical scholars will point to different things. But kind of the general consensus is that actually this is it's a reference really to two things. First of all, it is a specific reference to Emperor Nero, who we already talked about. See, we have in English, we have an alphabet that has letter, they all have sounds, and we have numbers that have numerical values. Actually, in ancient Hebrew, they didn't have two separate sets of characters. They used the same sets of characters, and they had sound, and they had numerical values. And so when you take Kaiser Nero, which is how you would say Caesar Nero, and when you take that and you add it all up, this is what you would actually get. And what's funny is when you get to Emperor Domitian, the time of Emperor Domitian, again, Nero's been dead for 20, 30 years, depending on when you exactly think Revelation was written. There was a rumor going around that either Nero had never died or that Nero had come back to life, and some people even viewed Domitian as a second coming of Nero. That's kind of how he was viewed. And so John kind of here is getting at hey, this is, you want to know what the embodiment of evil is? I mean, there are bad emperors. There are bad apples all over the place. But the biggest embodiment of it, this is what evil personified looks like. Look at Nero. Now, the other thing people point out is the number that's in throughout the whole Bible, Old and New Testament, that is the number of God, the number of perfection is 7. And so the other meaning of this is it's always one short of perfection. So again, if you go back, what John is presenting as the enemy of the people of God is this unholy trinity. And you have these dragons and these two beasts. There's 3 of them. And they're in opposition to the Trinitarian God. And they're always falling short. They're never getting there. Yes, they have power. Yes, they have influence. Yes, they can do things. But they're never perfect. They're always, every time, constantly falling short. This unholy trinity is failing. And so what you have in this kind of middle part of Revelation 12 and 13, as John is now kind of personifying evil, personifying the forces that are against the people of God, he presents this unholy trinity of this dragon and of these 2 beasts. And these 2 beasts representing Rome, whereas this dragon is the accuser, the Satan, the devil, the embodiment of evil. And what John is saying is the source of Rome's power is Satan. Now, John is not saying they're satanic in the way that they worship Satan. They worship all these different gods or goddesses. They're what would be called a pagan society. John's not saying they actually gather around and sing praise songs to Satan. But John is saying, listen, the power that they have and the way they wield that power is in direct opposition to God. the way that Rome rules, the way that Rome governs, the way that Rome leverages its power is polar opposite to God. Because again, how is Rome and the Satan depicted? As a dragon and as a beast, and how is God depicted in the person of Jesus as a slain lamb? That Rome, the way Rome works, the way Rome leverages all of its power and authority is in polar opposite to God and who God is and the way God is working and the way God is moving and the way that God wants to lead and govern the world. That the way Rome works is the embodiment of evil. Now, okay, sweet. What does that have to do with you and I? How does this matter to us at all? Because Rome is long gone. There are some similarities that we would have in our current situation compared to these 7 churches. There would be ways you'd be able to look at it and go, okay, the reality that they're living in, the cultural pressures that they face, cultural pressures that we face, there's some similarities. There's also some pretty big differences. And one of the biggest differences in you and I have lived the entirety of our lives in a culture, I'm assuming kind of we've all lived in, and I know this isn't true. I know people have lived all over the place, but I'm talking specifically about like a North American context, specifically in the United States. So most of us have probably lived most of our lives in the United States, and in that context, we have lived within kind of this culture, this society where Christianity has some influence. And where Christianity kind of comes from, in some ways, you might even call it a privileged position. The churches that John writes to, not even close. Again, they are a persecuted, marginalized minority. And the fact that they would ever come to a place where they would have influence in the Roman Empire never even occurred to them. Like, it wasn't even on their radar to like, hey, let's elect Christian Roman senators and let's get Christian Roman governors. It never occurred to them. Not in their wildest dreams. If you'd have told them, hey, several hundred years from now, Emperor Constantine will convert the empire and it'll be a Christian empire, it would have blown their mind. That wasn't what they were thinking. They were just trying to think, how do we live? How do we survive? How do we deal with everything that we're going through? How do we do all this? Whereas you and I live in this reality that so much of our world, whether we like it or not, whether we want to admit it or not, has been shaped by the influence of Christianity. I think he's a British guy. And he's a historian. He's an atheist historian. And his name, check it out, believe it or not, is Tom Holland. Not Spider-Man, different guy. But there is a British historian, and his name is Tom Holland. And he's an atheist, again, but he's kind of done all this research on the influence of Christianity in the Western world. And here's what he says. Here's his quote, which again, remember, this guy's atheist, so this is pretty profound. He says, people in the West, even those who may imagine that they have emancipated themselves from Christian belief, in fact, are shot through with Christian assumptions about almost everything. He said, all of us in the West are goldfish, and the water that we swim in is Christianity, by which, and this is important, so listen to this, because this is the important part, by which I don't necessarily mean the confessional form of the faith, but rather considered as an entire civilization. And here's what he means by that. What he means by that is he's saying, look, I'm not saying the confession that Jesus is Lord is what has shaped Western civilization. It's not, which that's actually the foundation of Christianity. But what he's essentially saying is the ethical system of Christianity is what has shaped the Western world. Not the confession, because again, the heart of Christianity is Jesus is Lord and he's saving the world. That's the heartbeat of Christianity. Tom Holland is saying that's not what shaped the Western world. What shaped the Western world is the ethical system of Christianity, because so much of the way our nation in the Western world was put together was kind of based on this assumption of Christian ethics. Like, you've probably heard this phrase before. I'll put it up here. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Right? This is an important statement in what is arguably the most important document in our nation. This statement does not make sense apart from a Christian worldview. Most cultures and most religions throughout history don't believe this. They don't believe that all people are equal. They don't believe that all people are valuable. They don't. But at the heart of Christianity, if you go back to the book of Genesis, is that God makes male and female in his image. And in Revelation, it's all people, tribes, and earth together. So this phrase that was used only makes sense if you come at it from a Christian perspective. Apart from a Christian perspective, it makes no sense. Now, this is why some people want to argue, like, that's why we have a Christian nation. Well, actually, if you look at the the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment is actually what keeps the United States from being a Christian nation or any other kind of nation, because it creates a separation of church and state. So I don't think it's accurate to say that our nation has ever been a Christian nation, because again, the Christian part of it is the confession that Jesus is Lord. And Holland's point is, our nation was not founded on the fact that Jesus was Lord. But what it was founded on is kind of this assumption of a Christian worldview. And so since its inception, our nation has had, like Christianity has kind of had almost really kind of the upper hand of, look, our worldview was used to shape everything that we hold dear. And so since the beginning in our nation, we have always operated with this idea that because we have this privileged status, this is how we hold on to this. This is how we ensure that things continue is all the way from the top. Because our founders assumed a Christian ethical worldview system to shape our country. And so how do we ensure that it continues to hold on to that? We continue to elect good Christian leaders, and we pass laws, and we've always operated from like this top-down system because that's the way we were founded. That's the way that it went. And so what happens now is we find ourselves in this reality where our culture is changing. And here, if you want my opinion, here's what's actually happening. What's actually happening is we're seeing what happens when you live with a Christian ethical system without the conviction that Jesus is Lord. This whole worldview, this whole ethical system is based on the fact that Jesus is Lord. If you don't have the confession that says Jesus is Lord, then this system doesn't work. Because what happens is, short of that central confession that Jesus is Lord, guess who becomes Lord? I become Lord. And I become master. And so I'm able to twist this entire worldview and ethical system to be all about me. And that's really what's happening in our culture now. Is the ethical framework is falling apart because the ethical framework is based on a conviction that our culture and our society doesn't hold and has really never held. And so that framework gets distorted to become about me, and it becomes about how do I honor me. And Christian ethical frameworks are based on how do I honor God? How do I make choices in my life that honor God? But without that central confession of, hey, Jesus is Lord, it becomes, well, I can just honor myself then. And that's essentially what's happening in all around us. So again, what does this have to do with Revelation? What does this have to do with the beast? Why are we even talking about this? The central argument of Revelation is that there is a battle. There is a war. And again, in Revelation 12 and 13, it's personified between God and between the dragon and these beasts. And what Revelation 12 and 13 it says is God is winning and he's going to win, but the dragon and the beast are powerful, extremely powerful. And they're waging war against God and his people. And they do real damage. And so here's the battle that's actually being fought. You have dragon power and you have lamb power. This is the battle that's going back and forth. Now this is super important. Super important. The dragon and the lamb aren't using the same kind of power. It is an entirely different kind of power. See, dragon power, the way it's described, again, on behalf of the dragon and then the two beasts, which are embodied by Rome, is power over. Why is Rome able to control the world? Because they have the power to control. If I'm in the position of authority, I'm the emperor, I'm the leaders, I'm the senate, I'm whatever, I'm the general, then I can control you because I have power over you to make you do what I want you to do. Now, that's not the way that God operates. Lamb power is personified in the person of Jesus. And what are we told about Jesus in the Gospels? John, who writes the Gospel of John, says that he came and made his dwelling among us. He lived as one of us. He died as one of us, and he overcame. See, the way God operates power through Jesus is entirely different. See, we tend to think of power as neutral. Power is like this neutral thing. And what determines whether or not power is good or bad is how someone uses it. If you get a good person, then they'll use power well, and if you get a bad person, they'll use it badly. That's why our solution to corruptions of power is, well, let's just get the right person in there. But do you ever notice that even when we get the right people in there, they still become corrupt? See, the issue isn't the person. Yes, the people are part of the problem. You and I are part of the problem. But I really think the biggest part of the problem, the bigger part of the problem, is that we are trying to use dragon power to do lamb work. See, this is the distinction that Revelation's making that's so powerful. Revelation's saying, listen, dragon power, this power over, this power to control, this power to manipulate, this power to force, it is real. And it does damage. And it's also 100% the opposite of the way God operates. God doesn't control. God gives freedom. God lives in and among his people. We are desperately trying to hold on to power over because, again, in our context, if you go back to how our nation was founded, this is what we were founded on. This is what we've tried to hold control over, and I get it. And I really think most people have done it with the best intentions. With the best intentions, we've held on to the wrong kind of power. What we need to do, honestly, if you're asking me, is to repent. And say, listen, as a church, we are to live with an entirely different kind of power. Now, hear me out on this. I'm not saying that, like, who's in positions of authority, who's in positions of power, like, it doesn't matter and we can just let it all be horrible. Yeah, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm not talking about how the nation should function. Revelation is written to the church. This is about how the church should function. This is about where the church puts its hope. And what Revelation is saying to these Christians over and over and over again is, don't put your hope in dragon power because it will fail. It is failing. Our hope is in lamb power. Our hope is power with. Our hope is that among us, in the midst of suffering, God is bringing about victory. This is the whole idea of the slain lamb. Jesus comes and lives among us, and he suffers, and he dies, and he's victorious. And again, go back to God and his people fighting against Satan and the dragon. And what are they fighting against? Their testimony. And that in the midst of their testimony, in the midst of their witness, in the midst of their love and their service, there is victory that is coming. And yes, they're facing persecution. And yes, they're facing struggles. And yes, they're facing trials. And yes, they're facing opposition. But the whole point of lamb power is that amidst struggle and amidst challenge and amidst suffering, there is victory. God came among us as powerless and died a brutal death. And that is the means by which he is reclaiming everything and making everything new. And see, Revelation says this is where victory comes from. So stop putting our hope in this. As a church, stop trying to operate with this. Stop trying to use dragon power to do lamb work. This is why, over the last probably maybe year or so, what we've talked about more than anything else, we keep coming back to this, if you've been here, you recognize this, is we've talked about these 7 practices. You don't have to read them all, but we keep coming back to, hey, we are forming our church as a community that is based on these 7 practices. And embodying and living these practices out every day in our life. We live them out here as a church, we live them out in our homes, we live them out in our communities. And here's why this is so important. Because what each of these practices does is it creates space. It creates space in our lives, it creates space in our relationships, it creates space in our church, it creates space in our homes, in our communities, and in that space, God can be present. And then God can do what only God can do. See, this is what lamb power looks like. Lamb power doesn't look like overcoming and conquering your enemies and defeating them and standing on a bloody battlefield of all the pagans that you've overcome. Victory is the faithful people of God transforming their world from the bottom up. This is what transformation looks like. Transformation does not happen top down. Revival does not happen top down. It happens from the bottom up. And Revelation is saying, this is our hope. This is our calling. This is our vocation, to be people who faithfully embody the life of Jesus in simple ways. You want to overcome the corruption, the evil, the confusion. You want to do all that? Pray. Be generous. Serve. Work toward reconciliation and peacemaking. That's how these early Christians overcame the Roman Empire. That's how God is working to transform our lives and our world. This is our vocation. This is our hope. This is lamb power. Let me pray. Father, I thank you for your love for us. I thank you that you came to this earth. You entered into creation. You lived, you died, and you rose again. And that is our victory. And that is our hope. And God, I know every day in our lives we're faced with all these different challenges and struggles, and we're faced with all these different options of what do we do and how do we respond. And God, I know most of us have been formed, myself included, have been formed and shaped in a world that doesn't really exist anymore. And so we try to scramble to figure out, what does it mean to be faithful? What does it mean to be a faithful follower of Jesus? And God, so many times the way we've done that is we've tried to hold on to dragon power to do lamb work, but that doesn't work. Because dragon power is antithetical to the work of the lamb. It is against it. So God, for the best of reasons and with the best motives, so many times we've done the wrong things. So God, yeah, we want to be good, responsible citizens of our nation. We do. But more than that, as a church, we want to be faithful witnesses of yours. People who embody lamb power in our lives, in our homes, in our workplaces, in our community. Because the hope of healing and change and transformation comes from a slain lamb. Father, we love you. We thank you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.